I started with a chair and a pricing guide and arrived at the deliberate replacement of an economic civilization. The system that built Independence Hall was not primitive. The community credit networks that sustained craftsmanship through 7-year apprenticeships were not inefficient in any absolute sense. The local currencies that kept value circulating within communities were not simply chaos waiting to be modernized. They were a different system, a system built on the principle that value should move between people in relationships of mutual knowledge and mutual accountability, rather than through institutions whose business model required inserting themselves into every transaction and collecting a fee for doing so. That system was replaced, methodically, through a sequence of legislative actions across a single decade. And what replaced it was not simply different. It was specifically constructed to produce a type of dependence that the old system made structurally impossible. In Part 2, I will show you what rose on the ruins of the old economy, and I will show you that what replaced it was not an upgrade in any meaningful sense of that word. Part 2, what they built on the ruins. There is a door in Philadelphia that has been opening and closing since 1773. The main entrance to Carpenter's Hall, the original door, the one that was there when the First Continental Congress gathered inside in September of 1774 to begin the process of creating a nation. The wood has not warped. The hinges have not failed. The joinery of the frame holds perfectly true after 250 years of use in a city that experiences every variety of weather the American Northeast produces. The average exterior door installed in an American home built in the last 30 years will need replacement in 15 to 20 years. Not because door technology has become more complicated, because the economics of building doors changed. The person who manufactured the modern door had no ongoing relationship with the home where it would be installed, no reputation to protect in that specific community, no name attached to the product that carried consequences beyond the warranty period. The craftsman who made the Carpenter's Hall door knew the building would be in his city when his children were grown, when his grandchildren were working. The door had to function for generations because there was no way to separate himself from what he had built. I am not being nostalgic about the past. I am pointing at a structural difference with measurable consequences. Those consequences explain everything that happened to America between 1863 and 1900. What the old system actually did. Before describing what replaced the guild economy, I need to be precise about the specific mechanisms that were destroyed, not just that they were destroyed, what functions they performed that made them worth replacing. The guild pricing system eliminated what modern economists call information asymmetry. Information asymmetry is the condition where one party in a transaction knows significantly more than the other party about the true value of what is being exchanged. In modern housing, healthcare, legal services, and dozens of other fields, information asymmetry is the default and exploited condition. The contractor knows what the work actually costs. The patient does not know what the procedure should cost. The party with more information extracts more value from every transaction. The guild pricing system made information asymmetry structurally impossible within the construction trade. The pricing formulas were transparent to every member. The calculation method was reproducible and verifiable. Any client who needed to know whether a price was fair could find out. The system was built from its foundation to prevent individual exploitation of the knowledge gap between expert and client. When that system was destroyed, information asymmetry became the permanent default condition of the American economy. It has never been corrected since. The barter and community credit system created something equally important and equally undervalued: financial relationships that were also social relationships. When a neighbor owed me for a winter of delivered firewood, that was not simply a financial instrument. It was a reason to maintain the relationship, a reason to show up when he needed help, a reason to stay in connection rather than drift apart. The debt was social before it was financial. Social debts tend to be settled in ways that reinforce community bonds rather than extract value from them. When bank credit replaced community credit, the social dimension was stripped out entirely. A bank does not care whether you and your neighbor maintain a good relationship. A bank cares whether payments arrive on schedule. The connection that the old debt relationship had maintained was replaced by an individual obligation to an institution that had no stake in the community itself. The local currencies kept economic value circulating within geographic communities. When a craftsman in Lancaster County earned Lancaster County currency, that currency went to the local blacksmith, who paid the local miller, who paid the local carpenter, who paid the local craftsman. Every transaction strengthened the web of local interdependence. Value that was produced in the community stayed in the community. When federal currency replaced local currencies, that circular flow was broken permanently. Value could move freely out of communities entirely. Or the craftsman now earned dollars that might be deposited in a national bank, investing them in railroad construction 2,000 miles away. The community captured less of the value produced within it. Centralized institutions captured more. These were not accidental side effects of modernization. They were predictable and, in some cases, explicitly intended consequences of specific policy choices. The company town Lowell, Massachusetts, was established in 1822 as the first fully developed company town in American history. By the 1880s, approximately 2,000 company towns existed across the United States. 2,000 in roughly 60 years. The speed of that expansion communicates how profitable the model was for the people who controlled it. Workers in company towns were paid in scrip rather than dollars. A scrip was a substitute currency that could only be redeemed at company-owned establishments. It looked like money, it had a face value, but it could not leave the company ecosystem. You could not save it and carry it to another town to start a new life. You could not invest it in something outside the company's reach. It was a token that flowed in one closed circle from the worker's labor directly back into company revenue. The Social Welfare History Project has documented in careful detail what this meant in practice. Without any external competition, company stores charged prices disconnected from any market reality. Company-owned housing rented at whatever the company decided to charge. Workers who arrived with modest savings found those savings gone within weeks at company store prices. Then the company extended credit for rent, for groceries, for the tools required to do the job. The debt grew faster than wages could reduce it, and a worker who owed more than he had earned could not simply leave without abandoning a debt that frequently came with legal consequences. 75% of all scrip circulating in America by the 1880s was issued by coal companies in 3 states: Kentucky, Virginia, and West Virginia. The men who mined the fuel that powered American industrial expansion were paid in tokens redeemable only in one place, the place that also collected their rent and sold them their food and extended the credit that kept them there year after year. We did not call it debt bondage. We called it employment. The Pullman strike. In 1894, George Pullman built what he considered a model industrial community on the outskirts of Chicago. Pullman, Illinois was clean and organized. The housing was better than most industrial workers had access to. Pullman considered himself a progressive and a philanthropist, but he owned everything: every house, every store, every square foot of ground. When economic depression in the early 1890s cut into Pullman Company profits, he reduced worker wages by 25 to 40% without reducing the rents he charged for company-owned housing. The workers struck. The strike spread across railroad lines because Pullman cars were used by multiple railroad companies. Within weeks, over 150,000 workers across 27 states had joined. The federal government sent troops. The strike was broken. 12 workers were killed in the process. A presidential commission was formed to investigate the causes. After examining conditions in Pullman and in similar company towns across the country, the commission issued a formal finding. George Pullman's system was un-American. Un-American. Those words were chosen precisely because what Pullman had built was a system where a man could work his entire adult life and never accumulate the independence that American political culture promised was the reward for honest labor. The commission understood that the company town was not an accident of industrial development gone wrong. It was a model designed from the beginning to prevent independence, to create permanent debtors rather than citizens capable of independence. By the time the commission issued that finding, the company town model had already replaced the old system in most of the country. The guild networks that had regulated fair pricing through community transparency. The barter systems that had bound neighborhoods and townships through webs of mutual obligation. The community credit that had allowed people to survive hard years without paying interest to institutions that had no stake in their welfare, all of it gone, replaced by scrip redeemable only at the company store and a debt no amount of labor could seem to fully settle. I pause sometimes and ask whether I am finding patterns that are not really there. Maybe the Homestead Act and the National Currency Act happened in the same year because Lincoln's government was simply juggling multiple problems at once, and the sequential effects were unplanned. Maybe company towns spread because industrialization required concentrated labor, and the exploitation that followed was the result of individual greed rather than systemic design. Maybe. But then I look at who still operates the old way, and the questions come back harder than before. The people who never stopped the Amish communities of Pennsylvania, Ohio, Indiana, and 23 other American states have been operating a contribution-based economy for over a century. When someone in an Amish community faces a medical bill they cannot pay, they stand up in the weekly congregation and explain the situation. The community does not disperse until enough has been contributed to cover the expense. Not charity, in the sense of giving to a stranger. Mutual insurance among people who know each other, who will all face emergencies at some point, who have collectively decided that covering each other's costs is both more efficient and more just than paying premiums to an outside company whose business model depends on minimizing what it pays out. When a barn burns, the community rebuilds it in a day. Everyone comes. The labor is contributed. The materials are pooled. The family that lost the barn will contribute the same labor and materials to the next family that needs it. The debt is social. It is settled not in dollars, but in presence and effort. This system works. It has worked continuously through economic depressions and wars and the complete transformation of American society for over a century. The Amish are not impoverished communities barely surviving at the margins of modern life. They are healthy communities with low debt, but low rates of the psychological disorders associated with financial precarity, and agricultural operations that have stayed in families for generations, without the cycles of farm debt that have destroyed conventional American agricultural communities at catastrophic rates. They do it without banks, without credit cards, without commercial insurance, without Social Security, without mortgages in the conventional sense, without financial products that everyone else is told are not optional features of modern life, but structural necessities. And here's the part I keep returning to. They had to fight to keep it. The Amish clashed with the federal government for years over Social Security, not because they were trying to avoid taxes. The Amish pay all federal and state taxes. The conflict was specifically about Social Security because the Amish do not understand it as a tax. They understand it as commercial insurance, and their faith prohibits them from purchasing commercial insurance because doing so implies a lack of faith in the community's ability to care for its own members. They already had insurance. It was the community itself. They did not need a government institution standing in the middle of every transaction and taking a management fee. Congress granted them an exemption in 1965 after years of legal conflict. Today, any Amish individual who wants to live under the community insurance system rather than the government system must file IRS Form 4029, an application for exemption from Social Security and Medicare taxes, and a formal waiver of benefits. An application, a request for special permission, to use a system their community has operated without incident for generations. The fact that they had to fight for permission proves that the old system had been made illegal, not through a single explicit law banning community insurance, through 100 smaller decisions that collectively made the old way of organizing economic life impossible to sustain without fighting the government for the right to do it. The fact that they are still here, still building barns in a day, still covering medical bills in a single congregation session, still farming land that has passed from parent to child for generations, proves that what they preserved actually functions. The scale of what was lost. I want to be precise about the numbers because the scale of the destruction is easy to underestimate when you're reading about it as history, rather than experiencing it as the lived reality of millions of families. In 1860, on the eve of the National Currency Act and the Homestead Act, the majority of American workers were either self-employed, employed by small shops and partnerships with fewer than 10 workers, or operating within guild and trade networks. Factory employment existed, but it was not yet the dominant mode of American economic life. By 1890, 30 years later, the majority of American workers were employed by corporations that they did not own and whose governance they had no formal voice in. They worked for wages. They lived in rented housing. They bought food from stores that they did not own. They were dependent on employer and landlord and merchant in ways that the craftsmen of 1750 Philadelphia would not have recognized as freedom. This transformation happened in one generation, and it happened in a context where the legislative tools that might have allowed people to organize collective alternatives, to maintain the community credit networks, to preserve the local currencies, to keep the guild accountability structures, had been systematically removed. The 10% tax on local currencies was not the only tool. Trade union organizing was legally vulnerable throughout this period. The courts regularly used the conspiracy doctrine to criminalize collective action by workers. The political influence of the railroad and mining and manufacturing interests on state and federal legislators was overwhelming. The people who benefited most from the transition to wage labor and company town economics had the resources to shape the legal environment that governed what alternatives were permitted. The Amish survived because they had a religious community structure strong enough to maintain group coherence under pressure and specific enough in its demands to make legal accommodation politically easier than forced assimilation. Most communities did not have equivalent resources for resistance. The wage that was not freedom. There is a phrase that appears regularly in the political rhetoric of the period between the Civil War and 1900. Wage slavery. Modern readers tend to treat this as hyperbole from labor activists overstating their case for rhetorical effect. But the people who used that phrase in the 1870s and 1880s had a specific and precise comparison in mind. They were comparing wage employment in a company town to the condition of people who had been legally enslaved before the war. The comparison was not about legal status. They understood the difference between chattel slavery and wage labor. The comparison was about the specific feature of company town employment that made it look more like the old system than like the free labor the war had supposedly established for everyone. The defining feature of slavery as an economic relationship was not violence, though violence was present. It was that the enslaved person's labor, housing, food, and movement were all controlled by a single entity. You worked for the entity that owned your house and sold you your food and determined where you could go and what you could spend. There was no exit, no alternative, no outside point of leverage from which you could negotiate the terms of your existence. The company town reproduced exactly that structure without the legal ownership. The miner worked for the company that owned his house and operated the store where he bought his groceries and held the debt he had accumulated and could pursue through legal channels if he tried to leave. He could not save money because the prices at the company store consumed wages faster than they accumulated. He could not leave because the debt would follow him. He could not organize because the law treated collective action as conspiracy. The men who called this wage slavery were not being rhetorical. They were being precise, and the people in power who built the company town system understood this. The Pullman Commission did not call the model un-American because they were shocked that exploitation existed. They called it un-American because it reproduced in the free labor economy the specific architecture of dependence and control that the Civil War had supposedly ended.